From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Veterans History Project Pavilion on this historic weekend as we join with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and the American Battle Monuments Commission in honoring our nation's World War II veterans. It's something that's long overdue. The Veterans History Project, which is part of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, preserves the wartime memories of veterans and those who served in support of them. The project was created in October of 2000 through the unanimous support of the Congress. They wanted to honor our nation's war veterans for their service and to collect their stories and experiences. So this program is not only nationwide, it's an oral history and documentation effort that relies on volunteers rather than professional oral historians in collecting these artifacts and their stories. So this weekend, you will see roving around volunteers with purple shirts or purple hats. I see somebody down here right now. I want you, please, if you have a chance to just tell a little bit of your story, just for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, we want your story. Everyone has a story to tell, and we want to get as many of those stories this weekend as we possibly can. You'll also notice here in the pavilion that we're gladly accepting memoirs, letters, photos for inclusion in this ever-growing collection. And your precious wartime materials will be preserved for many generations to come in the Library of Congress at the American Folklife Center. So far, you believe it or not, we've collected over 80,000 items from over 16,000 individual veterans in what has become one of the largest national repositories of first-hand war experiences ever collected in this country. For those of you who would like to share your story online, we have computer stations over here near the entrance to the pavilion where you can enter your wartime memories just by typing it into the computer station. And volunteers are standing by to assist you in this special opportunity. You can also contribute memories from your home computer when you get home by accessing www.loc/vets. Don't worry if you didn't write that down or you didn't get it right now and you're not going to remember, because I would never remember it. We have brochures back on the back table that will give you more than you will ever want to know about the Veterans History Project, but especially it will give you that place to go on the internet to tell your story. We'd like to remind you that the work of the Veterans History Project is a full-time activity, and it continues well after this weekend. So we're collecting stories from veterans from 5 wars: World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf Wars. The project includes all participants, men and women, civilian and military, and it documents the contributions of civilian volunteers, support staff, and war industry workers, as well as the experiences of military personnel from all ranks and all branches of the service, from the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy, as well as the U.S. Coast Guard and the Merchant Marines. So we invite you to join us in collecting stories and getting others involved. Our website includes much more information on how you can join into this effort, and you'll learn about the 1,000 partner organizations around the country that are helping us with this tremendous effort. So thank you again for joining us on this historic occasion, and a special thanks to all the veterans for your service in this country. I want to applaud them. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Tom Swope and Commander Everett Alvarez, who are going to be moderating and leading this panel on POWs who are going to tell their unique story. Please give them a hand.
First, I'd like Everett to say a few words, and then we'll get to the panel. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to listen to some real interesting stories. So without delay, we would like to get into the experience of the individuals up here. We have on my left Richard Francis, who was a POW in the Philippines and in Japan. Marty, to the other is Jimmy Kanaya, and also Marty Higgins on the end down there.
Very good. In case you missed it, I'm Tom Swope, and I am a volunteer with the Veterans History Project, and I'm actually not affiliated with any particular organization except my wife. She helps me underwrite this project. I'm trying to embarrass her. I'd like they've already been introduced, so I'd like the panel members to describe the day that they were captured. And we'll start here with Jimmy.
I'm going to read over this. They're on? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm Jim Kanaya from Gig Harbor, Washington. Army Medical Service Corps. Actually, at that time, was Army Administrative Officer. Just received my commission in overseas. And I served in the Italian campaign and in the Southern France campaign.
I was with the 36th Division, and December 9th, they gave up on my company, and we were still fighting December 10th. And it turned out that Charlie Company, who was supposed to back us up, went to the wrong city and said we weren't there. I had been wounded, we're out of ammunition, but I can say this, when I walked out with my hands up, it was one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life.
Would you like to go ahead and describe the day that you were captured? Tell more about that.
The day I was captured, it's a kind of a long story, but as a medic, we relied upon the Geneva Convention to protect us most of the time. I was evacuating casualties from one battalion to another. In other words, I was assisting another battalion. I didn't have to, but I volunteered again. You're not supposed to volunteer, but I did. We had about 6 litter cases, and we had 3 or 4 walking wounded carrying the Red Cross flag in front as a truce to let us through the German lines. The Germans were infiltrating between the 2 units. And lo and behold, we had German prisoners helping us carry the wounded over the mountains. Well, if we have German prisoners, we had to have armed infantry guards. And that's a no-no. And I had no say-so about it, but I let it go anyway because it was not my direct responsibility. But lo and behold, sure enough, right in the middle of our return back to our lines, we ran into another company, about an oversized platoon of Germans commanded by a German officer, and they stopped us, and we tried to let us through, but of course they said, no, they got a prize because they had a couple of lieutenants and the sergeants and about 5 or 6 enlisted men and about 8 or 10 wounded men. So they had a big discussion. And all of a sudden the German guards came around and started taking the rifles away from our guards. And there was a big tug of war for the rifle as who's going to get the rifle. Needless to say, the Germans outnumbered us, and that was the end of our freedom, and we became a captive from that point on.
And as Everett mentioned, Richard Francis was in the Philippines, so he could describe the day he was taken prisoner. We should mention that it was made very clear to him a few months after Pearl Harbor that there would be no help arriving for you in the Philippines.
Yes, well, my first day of surrender was I was in the mountains above Mariveles on the Bataan Peninsula, and we knew that surrender was only a few short hours away. And sure enough, the next morning we were told that we had surrendered and walked down the zigzag road to Mariveles and joined in with larger groups. Don't join in with any small groups or anything like that. Join in with larger groups, and it should be all right. So we started down the zigzag path, and we all had 45s. Some of us had rifles, but we what we did was he took our 45s and our rifles and broke them down. That means take everything out of it you can take out and throw it away. So we broke it down into pieces and threw the pieces in the jungle. And we went down to Marivelis, and we joined up with a large group, and we sat there for 3 days with no food and no water. What water we had in our canteens, but we didn't get any food. And then they started to march us out of there in groups of anywhere from 700 to 1,000, and we started on a death march. We didn't know it was a death march at that time, but it turned out real quickly that it was going to be a death march. That was our first day.
Very good. You had something, Everett?
No, I think that that tells it. There's Marty has some very good stories also with regard to marches.
I have to back up a little bit on this. I knew nothing about POW camps. And the Germans wanted to send me to a hospital. I wanted to stay with my men. I ended up headed for an officers' camp. They had non-com camps and A&M camps. Well, after about 3 days of sleeping in sheds, 2 SS officers picked the 4 officers up and drove us to a Bavarian hotel. They wined and dined us, and Jack Crown was the first one that was called out of the room. And as he passed me, he said, "Heinrich Himmler," he whispered. So I had heard of Heinrich Himmler, and I walked into the room. He was dressed in a black tunic, rimless glasses. He looked like a perfect businessman. The German general that was doing the interrogation, I'm pretty sure Himmler could understand English, but he pretended he didn't. He was so damn mad at us. We had killed so many. We were in buildings. And the Germans didn't know where we were. They would come around in a column of threes. We're like shooting fish in a barrel. And we didn't have one man killed. We had very few casualties. And it was an under-strength company. He thought we were a regiment. And anyway, they never asked any security to breach any security. But they asked us things like, how did I like Roosevelt? Which I didn't at the time. And I said, he's a great man. I was very arrogant. And the German general, he was more arrogant. And anyway, the last thing the German general said to me, "You are lucky you will get back alive." And I looked him in the eyes and said, "I would not have minded dying for my country." On the way back to the room, I said, "That was stupid." You don't say things like that to a hatchet man. And the SS troops, I don't know how long I should go with this, but the SS troops picked us up to take us back to the barn where we were staying. And in the back of this truck, there was some rations. And I said, "Fellas, there's some cheese back here. Should I take it?" And everybody agreed. So I put it in my pocket. And about 20 minutes later, after the SS troops dropped us off and shook hands, they're back screaming like hell. So I reached in my pocket and gave them the cheese. And they hit me, not too badly. Then they kept screaming. We didn't know what the hell was happening. Well, Jack Crown, without checking with us, had taken 3 or 4 items. And they beat the hell up out of him. And the thing that bothered me is they said, "That's an act against the Third Reich. You may be shot." And I lived on that until we had the march out of Schumann. That's my story.
Now, those of you who know your World War II history, we're skipping around a little bit, and I wanted to make sure that we had time to tell this story. Jimmy has a fascinating story about a thing called the Hammelburg Raid.
The Hammelburg Raid. If any of you read the book by General Patton after the war, he made a statement in the book, in the last chapter, that the only mistake he ever made in the whole war, discounting the fact that he slapped this poor soldier in Sicily, he said the mistake he made was that he did not follow up the Hammelburg Raid, which is a raid to liberate our camp in Hammelburg of all the American officers that were captured from North Africa into the Bulge. And he stated that he did not indicate that his son-in-law was in that camp. The raid was supposed to be to liberate the officers in a camp like MacArthur liberated the prison camp in the Philippines at that point. But he wanted to outshine MacArthur. But the real story was his son-in-law, John K. Waters, Lieutenant Colonel, captured in North Africa, was our camp executive officer. Colonel Paul Good was the camp commander, senior officer. And there were about 1,100 officers there when we got there from Poland. Our group of 1,400 officers left Poland. We ended up in Hammelburg with about 440 officers. And we joined over 1,000 officers that are already there from the previous campaigns in the Western Front. So when the task force of company of armored infantry and a company of tanks, reinforced by recon cavalry and some 105 artillery on tanks, when they reached our camp, they punched a line through the German front and traveled 55 miles through enemy territory to reach our camp. Can you imagine that? Small task force of some 450 men reached our camp. Took them almost all day to reach us. They had to fight their way here and there. And along the way, they knocked down telegraph lines so they wouldn't be able to communicate as to which way the task force was headed. And this really, I might say, disrupted the German defenses, because this action by this task force created a havoc in the rear area. And of course, when they got to our camp, General Patton felt that there were only about 400 of us there from Poland. He didn't count on the fact that over 1,000 officers were captured during the Bulge. And we scrambled on to the tanks and whatever we could carry with us, and we took off. And of course, by that time, all the escape routes were blocked. Every lead tank that tried to break through got knocked out. And we were down to about half of the strength, and there were only about, maybe out of 1,400 officers, I would say less than 50 of us remained with this task force trying to escape back to our lines. But it was a futile attempt. We were completely surrounded. We couldn't get out. We were going around in circles, and I knew exactly where we were. So me and two other lieutenants decided, oh, what the heck, let's go back to camp. And most of us did go back to camp. And on our way back to camp, about halfway there, we heard tanks rumbling up, and they just completely annihilated the remnants of this task force. Now, I really feel that these men probably deserve more credit than any other action in the war to be able to break through. And that I understand that General Patton promised the task force commander, Abe Baum was the name, captain commanding this task force, a Medal of Honor if he made it. And Abe in his book says, oh, that's a bunch of bull. He knew that it's going to be a tough fight, but he made every effort, and I think he deserves a lot of credit. He did get the DSC, the Distinguished Service Cross, the next highest award. And that raid is something that not well known, because Patton was not really authorized to do that. That raid went into another army sector, and his army was diverted going northeast, and the 7th Army was next to Patton's army, and this task force went into the 7th Army area under another general's command. So that was a violation right there. And it was a failure from the very beginning, as we see it now. You know, at that point, we were elated. We're going to be liberated. And what a feeling. These guys went 55 miles in front of the lines through the German countryside and tried to rescue us. And I give that raid group a lot of credit.
I've heard this story from I've heard the story of the Hammelburg Raid from a couple of World War II veterans, and it's really an interesting story about Patton that I don't think was in the movie. Richard Francis, go ahead.
Richard has some interesting stories. Richard, you were in Camp O'Donnell. You spent some time there. What were the conditions like, and how about a story about that?
And actually, I don't think we talked a lot about the Death March, if you'd want to talk a little bit before we get to Camp O'Donnell.
Hello. Oh, well, I'll start out with the rest of the Death March here. But as I mentioned before, the Death March out of Bataan was one of the greatest atrocities of World War II. Now, of the 10,000 Americans that were in Bataan and who made the 70-mile Death March, there are less than 200 of us alive today. That's pretty sad. For the group of 2,000, roughly 2,000, that I made the Death March, had very little or no food to eat for 11 days and very little water to drink. It wasn't due to the lack of water. The thing is, there were artesian wells all along the roadside there, and they could have stopped and gotten water, but the Japs wouldn't let us do it. If one or two men had run to the well to get the water, why, they were usually shot or bayoneted. And after that happened a couple of times, why, somebody got together and there was 100 or 200 of us who would run for water, and they wouldn't randomly shoot. The thing is, they would just get around behind us and push us with their bayonets back into line. But maybe somebody would get some water. So, and then most of us had malaria at that time, and we were really in a weakened physical condition. If we fell or to the ground or passed out from fever, we weren't able to stand up. The Jap guards would either bayonet or shoot us. So
At one point,
what?
at one point, you did get.
Oh, so then we just. The malaria, why, I started feeling real woozy at one time, and I knew I was going to either pass out or fall, and I knew what the consequences were, but I managed to sneak out of the Death March through some bushes onto some land the other side that was pretty well hidden, and I sat down on the ground or on a log, and shortly after that, a man or somebody rapped me on the shoulder, and I looked up, and it was a Filipino, an elderly Filipino man, and I started to talk to him, and he didn't speak English. So I made a motion that mosquito and mosquito bite, and he understood that, and he said, wait. So he went to, took off, and a few minutes later he came back with a Japanese corpsman, a Japanese medical corpsman. And oh boy, here it is now. And I did the same thing for the Japanese corpsman. I pointed a mosquito bite, and he got out a syringe and put something in it. And oh boy, here it goes. He wanted me to give myself an injection, and I said, no, you do. I wouldn't know how to give myself an injection. So he gave me an injection, and a short time after that, I did start to feel better. And he had me stand up, and he said, okay, made motions to get back in the line, get back in the line. So we got, I said, well, I made comments to him, you and both of us go out there, because the guard would probably shoot me if I came back. And so he went back, and the guard did see the two of us come back there. And he came running down, and jabber, 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 jabber. And the two of them talked, and the guard kept shaking his head and shaking his head. And finally, they just mentioned for me to get back in the line. So I got back in the line. And the guard went his way, and the corpsman went his way. But by golly, it probably came close to saving my life, and that's one of the two things that helped me out from the Japanese. But then we,
Well, as Everett mentioned, you got to Camp O'Donnell. There's a grueling train ride that's in there, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that, but eventually his oral history will be up on the website. You should definitely listen to it.
Yeah.
But go ahead. When you got to Camp O'Donnell, the camp commander read you a welcome speech.
Oh, yes, we had a welcome speech, and my first recollection was standing here at the entrance camp after the train ride, and where the Japanese camp commander was giving us his welcome speech. The gist of his speech, through an interpreter, was that his only interest in Americans were those who were dead and a number that had died. Also, that we were his captives and would be treated as such. Japan is now establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Americans are soft and cowards. President Roosevelt and General MacArthur will be hanged as war criminals when Emperor Hirohito rules the United States from the White House in Washington, D.C. You are enemies of the Japanese Empire, and we will fight you for 100 years. You are not honorable prisoners of war, you are captives. Forget you have names. Forget you have parents, wives, and children. Your loved ones no longer care for you and have forgotten you, just as Roosevelt and your generals have forgotten you. Anyone trying to escape will be shot. That was our welcome speech. And he was right. Treatment was so bad that while we were in Camp O'Donnell the first few weeks or so, 1,600 more Americans out of the 10,000 that started on the death march passed away. So,
Everett? Did you have something, Everett? You were at Camp O'Donnell for a short while, and then you were set out on a communications detail.
Okay, yeah, I was in Camp O'Donnell for a short time, and they were sending, the Japanese were sending details out to work on roads, on bridges, and cleaning up this and cleaning up that. And our signal officers told us not to go out on any details unless we absolutely had to. Because one of these days they were going to call for a electronic detail. And sure enough, they did call for 15 men, and I was one of the 15, being a specialist in transmitter and receiver repair. I was one of the 15, and they took us down to Fort McKinley, and we started to repair the equipment. And the thing is, now repairing equipment to aid the enemy is a no-no. But the thing is, we sabotaged more equipment than we repaired. And I don't know whether they ever caught on or not, but there were some boxes with brand new receivers in them that had arrived from San Francisco that we're going to be using. And they wanted those fixed. We said they're bad. They're being sent back to San Francisco because we haven't got the parts to fix them here. Oh, okay, tear them apart and use them for spare parts. Brand new receivers. So it did work out. The receiver did work out, and then after the detail was over, one other thing we did that when we had the receivers upside down on a working bench and testing with test prods, voltages, resistances, we were listening to KGEI San Francisco. So we got all our news from KGEI. We knew what was going on, but it was.
And also the other part of that story is the Japanese guard came around and said you had to fix up a radio so he could listen to the Tokyo station. Marty and Jimmy, you were also involved in, I guess some have described, I'm not sure if the particular march you were on, were the Death March in Europe. Let's start with Marty. Tell about you were on a march in January of '45?
If I may, I'd like to switch subjects. I'd like to switch subjects, Tom. The first march was very unpleasant. I would like to talk about Frank Maxwell.
Let's go to Frank.
A lot of people don't know that we had horse cavalry in World War II. I had joined the Horse Cavalry in Brooklyn, New York to ride horses. We were called up to active duty in January of '41. We were half mechanized, half horse. I ended up going to OCS, that's another story. I was scheduled to go to OCS. Every fourth class was horse. And this friend of mine, I thought, bumped me from the 12th to the 13th. Well, he ended up, after he graduated, going to the 1st Cavalry Division. I ended up going to the 10th Cavalry, colored enlisted men and white officers, and riding till March of '44. But let me get back to Frank Maxwell. When I finally got to the prisoner of war camp, we were captured December 10th. I know they took us through Berlin subway trains, and people would give us the V for victory, surreptitiously. Well, when I got to Half Flag 64 on New Year's Eve, or New Year's Day, really, they were very careful that the Germans didn't plant people to spy on. We had a radio, and they didn't know where the hell it was. Well, who's there but Frank Maxwell? We had met, I got the story a little backwards. Anyway, Frank and I met in Jersey City in November of '42. He went back to the infantry to get his orders, Fort Benning. I went back to the cavalry to get my orders. That's where I jumped to the 10th Cavalry. The next time I saw Frank was in Flag 64. 2 weeks after I was there, he was repatriated by the Swiss because of ulcers. He gave me his extra long johns, which came in very handy on the forced march, and he gave me his long socks. But the most significant thing, he was able to call my wife and say I was alive. All she had was MIA. Thank you.
And Jimmy, you can go ahead and tell us about the march that you talked about before along the Baltic.
That march started when the Russian offensive broke through the German lines in the winter of '44, January 21st, was the day we had to evacuate camp because of the artillery fire. We could hear the artillery booming, and we knew that something was going to happen. And we were rousted out one morning at 7 o'clock, pack up and move. Minus 21 degrees, cold, and we had overcoats. We were issued nothing. It was the U.S. Army. It was all British or French or Belgium overcoat, and we looked like a ragtag bunch of refugees. But here we went. Of course, I was still one of the younger lieutenants, and I was still in pretty good shape. But some of the older men started to drop out the very first day. About 1,400 of us started, and after the second day, only 1,000 were left. About 400 dropped out the first 2 days. And at that point, I was the only one among 1,000 officers who was not a Caucasian or a white officer. And of course, did I stand out? I don't know. I had to put up with it. Whatever they had, any detail came along, I was the last man. I was always the last man, the junior officer. But along the march, at one point, we were moving along parallel with about 5,000 Russian prisoners of Germany, Russian prisoners. And I looked over there, they were all Orientals. They're all looking at me. They think that I should have been over there on their side. Did the Russian have an all Oriental army division? I don't know. But later found out that they were Mongols from Siberia that Russians recruited for their army and captured. They were captured by the Germans. And there are a couple of other incidences that came up that they singled me out because I looked different, and it kind of made me wonder. Sometimes it was advantageous because we were marching along with one French column, a column of French soldiers off to our left. And I was on the far right-hand side of our column of about 500 to 1,000 troops, soldiers. And this one French soldier comes running through our column, right through our column, and he pats me on the shoulder and puts a flask of whiskey in my face. He says, "Drink this." And he took a sip to prove that it was pure, and it was pure alcohol. and I wasn't drinking in those days. He put the cap back on, and ran back through our column and back to his column. Now, why did he do that? Why did he pick me out? Did I look like I needed a drink? I don't know. But we finally ended up at Hammelburg, that I mentioned, the Hammelburg Raid. And at that time, we hiked pretty close to 400 miles. Somebody says 385, 390. We kept kilometer record. I kept a diary, by the way. And a diary I kept, I didn't write it in clear English because if I was captured, or if the Germans caught me, why, they could probably incriminate me for telling false lies or something. But all these years, I try to read what I wrote, and it's so cryptic that now I can't even read it. But these, I'm gonna have to say one thing about the Germans. The German guards tried to abide by the Geneva Convention the best way they could. I think they did anyway. But they deprived us of food, but they themselves were deprived of food. So I really didn't feel that we were being mistreated to that extent. But lack of food did take its toll. A lot of our men were losing weight, and they were on the march. It was cold. The weather and the cold and the lack of food took its toll. We lost over 1,000 officers on that march in our group, and I'm sure most of them made it back by way of either by medical route or by way of Russia. The Russians overran their position, or some of them did not make it back. We saw officers lying on the side of the road, frozen. Their arms are hanging up over the snow. And were they our officers? We don't know. Their Polish officer camp was next to ours, and they were moved out before we did, and they were not in very good shape. Our group was pretty good shape, but even then we lost over 1,000 officers. And that, to me, our group that left Poland off Flag 64, we have a reunion every couple of years. We're down to about 45, 50 officers that attend. And we still kind of communicate with each other. And we probably will have one of those last man clubs one of these days. And I hope to be the last man.
Bob, the day of liberation was a big day for everybody. I know it was a big day when I finally came back to the States and liberated from the Vietnam. But why don't we start, Richard, with your story about your day of liberation?
Our day of liberation, let's go back here. We were up in Japan at that time. We were up in Hanoi. We were working as slave labor in a copper mine in northern Japan. And one day we fell out to go to work, and the Japanese told us that no work this morning. We'll go up this afternoon. Noontime came when we lined up to go to work, and he said, no work. We're too busy with other things. We'll line up to go to work tomorrow. Tomorrow came, and we lined up, and the Jap commander came out there, and that was unusual. And he told us that the war was over. And that was on August 14th, 1945. And put us in charge of our own senior officers, who immediately asked for some cans of yellow paint and paintbrushes. And some of the fellows out of our detail went up on the roof of the building we're in and painted Hanawa, 550 POWs. And they knew that one of these days an observation plane would be flying over. And sure enough, one did, but we didn't see it. All we did was hear it. And the next day, when the 6 U.S. Navy torpedo planes came up and dropped a message to us saying that when the observation plane had been over the day before and they developed the negatives, that they saw some writing, and they saw, when they got it large enough, they saw Hanawa, 550 POWs. They came back to investigate. And they said they couldn't drop us anything at this time, but they'd already radioed Saipan. And our supplies would be up the next day. Food, clothes, medicine would be up the next day. And sure enough, the next day, the B-29s arrived. They were huge. and they started dropping out all these things to us on parachutes. And one of the medicines they dropped to our was penicillin. Well, our doctors didn't know what it was. So they went up on a roof again and paid penicillin and a bunch of question marks. And a couple of days later, we had our doctors in the drop had a book on penicillin. So that worked out real well.
Very good. There was issued a kill them all order, basically. They had planned to execute all the prisoners in the Pacific. And I'm going to read just a tiny bit from this. The method, whether the POWs are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates. In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single POW. That order actually had been written in January of '44, and it had been issued, and Richard was scheduled to be executed. His camp was scheduled to be exterminated at the end of August, and he was liberated 2 weeks before that. The other gentleman here should tell us about the Day of Liberation. First, let's start with Jimmy.
The Day of Liberation?
Yes.
Day of Liberation. Actually, I don't think we were really liberated in that sense. The U.S. Army, and particularly the 45th Division, as I recall, the armored unit of that division broke through our front gate, and that was a mistake, because when they broke through that gate, about 20 to 30,000 Russian prisoners took off, and they raided the town, and then they came back with all the loot, you might say, and they were having a ball and getting drunk and eating pigs and horses and cows, and they were making up for lost time. So we had to put the camp back in order again. U.S. personnel were on one side, the Russians were on the other side. And we had free movement, but we had to stay close because we did not know when we would be completely moved from camp. It took over a week after that tank broke through our front gate before we were finally moved out. And so that day of liberation is sort of a lingering liberation. And I recall I was a medic, so all the medical facilities for our camp in Nuremberg was handled by the Serbians. The Serbian medical people handled all the Allied prisoners' medical problem. And me being a medic, they thought that I could help them, so I was working with the Serbian doctors and corpsmen and taking care of U.S. prisoners' problems. And so after the liberation, the Serbians themselves went berserk and brought all the loot back from the town of Nuremberg, which was devastated. And they would invite me to all their parties, big barbecues, and boy, and I had diarrhea, and I was sick, and I had fever, and I ate, and I vomited, and I ate, and it was a mess. But I didn't want to lose any more weight than I could. I already lost about 40 pounds, and then of course after we were put on aircraft, C-47, to fly from Nuremberg to Le Havre, Camp Lucky Strike. I got so sick that floor of that aircraft was full of you know what. And that's the last time that I really got sick. I think I realized then that don't eat before you fly.
And Marty, go ahead and tell us about the Day of Liberation.
Well, the Day of Liberation happened to eventually be my son's birthday, April 22nd. The interesting thing is the Russians liberated our camp in Luckenwalde, Germany. The combat people were fabulous. They treated us well. We got along with them. And then the political commissar came up, and they said, no Americans can leave here. They were going to inculcate us with their whatever. And I ended up, well, we were sending up troops. Truman had agreed with Stalin to stop our troops at the Elbe River. But they were sending up empty 2.5-ton trucks, and the Russians wouldn't let us leave. So I put on a British uniform and a French beret and with about 4 others, took off through the French compound, and we were the only ones on the truck. The interesting thing is when we got to Camp Lucky Strike, they fed us a steak, mashed potatoes, string beans, the works. We all threw up.
You know, we have about 2 minutes left, but very quickly, another fellow who was supposed to be here this afternoon is also was a POW in Germany in World War II, was Enzo Biginati. Enzo was going to read some things here, but tell a little bit about his story. Our time is almost up, but I just wanted to say that his story was how he ran into one of his best friends from his hometown, which was Kensington, Connecticut, and he ran into his best friend who wound up to be a POW in the same camp. And when they saw each other, you know, one of them, they saw each other and they yelled out, "Vidouche," and the other guy said, "Enzo," and so that was a major shock. I mean, think of the odds. Well, the reason I wanted to say this is that Mr. Biginati had told us that this fellow of Vidouche, his name is Victor Baccaro, was supposed to be here and be in the audience. And did he come? We don't know, but if he is, would you please? He probably didn't do it, but that was a good story also. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, and we wish Biggie the best. Corbin Willis. Is Corbin Willis in the audience? Over there? Corbin, we wanted to mention you because your story has been submitted to the Veterans History Project, and if folks would like to learn a little bit about your experiences, it's up on the web for all to see, but Corbin, thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.